Hey everybody, welcome to my podcast. Today we're going to be talking about first responders and the use of dark humor. We all know humor allows us to get through tough situations, right? So it makes sense that our responders would be using it. But I think we should really look at how the brain works, how it uses humor, how it might even help our responders avoid the process that leads to PTSD and all the other good things that can come with it. But also we have to talk about all of the cons or all of the potential problems that can come with it, where it might help one responder avoid PTSD. It could contribute to another responder or a victim or witness experiencing PTSD. So, I think we have to find that sweet spot in the middle where it provides the relief of the negative emotions of the whatever is the bad situation that you're in without going too far and causing more negative emotions for whoever's around you. So it's kind of versus you have to weigh, how am I going to benefit from the dark humor versus how are the people around me going to be affected by it? Are they going to benefit from it, or are they going to be negatively affected by it? So there are two things. You have to think of yourself, and then you have to think of the audience. Okay, let's just start with the definition of humor so we can understand how it works. According to Merriam-Webster, humor, there are three parts, can be that quality which appeals to a sense of the ludicrous or absurdly incongruous, a funny or amusing quality. And then the second one is the mental faculty of discovering, expressing, or appreciating the ludicrous or absurdly incongruous, the ability to be funny or to be amused by things that are funny. And then the third part is something that is or is designed to be comical or amusing. Dark humor, I think humor in general is, like it said, you're looking at the incongruous, usually it has to do with the fault of some human trait, right? Like something that's not, it's a fault that somebody has, it's a weakness that somebody has, and you're kind of making light of that. So, obviously you're not gonna make a joke about something that's good about somebody. It always has to be a contrast of something that's not so good about that person. That's how humor works. Dark humor is taking it a little bit further. You're not just looking at someone's weakness. You're actually looking at things like, for example, what it says here, dark humor is humor that treats sinister subjects like death, disease, deformity, handicap, or warfare with bitter amusement and presents such tragic, distressing, or morbid topics in humorous terms. So with dark humor, we're just taking regular humor a step further away from someone's weakness or faults to terrible subjects. Death, people in car accidents, people with injuries or death or diseases, those kind of things. So, also there's sort of like a recipe. There's a recipe for what makes something funny. I'm going to talk here a little bit about something, what did they call it? It's called the benign-violation theory. So this is what the research is telling us. So in their initial psychological science paper published in 2010, McGraw and a colleague established that situations involving benign violations, this is the kind of the key words here, benign violations, which means benign good, violations bad. Okay, so it's that incongruence there. These were funnier than those involving either plain old benign actions, meaning all good, or malicious violations, meaning all bad. They found evidence for this tendency across 5 experiments. For one test, they showed pairs of scenarios to study participants who rated each situation for its level of threat and humor. I just wanted us to get a clear picture from the get-go here. What is the formula for dark humor? How does it work? So one of the scenarios of this McGraw group involved a young girl who knows that her father has lost his job and that her family is having money problems. In response, the girl decides to sell her virginity on eBay. About 78% of study participants found that behavior to be wrong, but 45% still said it made them laugh. In the paired scenario, the same girl responds to the crisis by selling her jewelry on eBay. Virtually no test participants considered this to be a violation, and none considered it funny either. Simply put, people were much more likely to find a situation funny if it simultaneously threatened their conventional notions without striking them as too severe. So it can't be all good, it can't be all bad or too bad. It has to be somewhere in the middle. So one interesting finding I also found in the research had to do with the person's mental state before the use of the dark humor and whether they were able to appreciate the dark humor based on that mental state. So what you would think maybe that, or at least I thought, that the more depressed or angry, the more negative someone's state of mind was before the dark humor joke or situation, the more likely they would be to sort of be attracted to dark humor. Because I just thought like angry people are sarcastic. That makes sense to me. But actually research shows otherwise. It said that people who are angry are not feeling stable emotionally. They are not able to enjoy dark humor. Whereas the people that are more stable and are in a better mood, they are the ones who are more often able to appreciate dark humor. So why do I bring this up? I bring it up because I think it kind of supports my argument earlier about the emotional agility training for our responders. So if I really think that dark humor could potentially avert the process of PTSD, meaning, and I'll get into the details here in a second, meaning that memories are encoded with the language narrative, so they have a timestamp, therefore you don't get PTSD. If I feel like dark humor can prevent PTSD, then that means our responders have to be in an they have to be in a positive, healthy, stable state in order to go into to appreciate the dark humor, to use it as a tool. So they need emotional agility training to make sure that they're in a good mental state throughout their duty and on all those, calls. So if you have responders who are tired, stressed out, burnt out, depressed, angry, whatever, hungover, they may not appreciate or be able to enjoy or use dark humor to avoid PTSD. So I know it doesn't sound intuitive, but it is apparently what the research is saying. So like I said, in my mind, that supports the emotional agility training so we can keep our responders in a healthy state of mind. And then they can enjoy the dark humor and then they can avoid PTSD. So just a little more research here. According to Willinger et al. In 2017, they looked for correlations between one's ability to appreciate dark humor versus all kinds of pre-existing factors, including they looked at emotional state, they looked at intelligence, IQ, they looked at verbal and nonverbal intelligences, they looked at aggression toward others, and they looked at internalized aggression toward self. Just to name a few. They looked at a lot of other factors. So here were some of the results. Oh, I just want to also make a note here. Obviously, this research was not done with responders who are in a terrible situation in real time, needing to use the dark humor to get that psychological distance as a relief to stay in their bodies during this difficult situation. In this research, the people were in a laboratory or a classroom or wherever, safe place, and they were presented with cartoons, which are obviously theoretical and not in other words, there's not a bleeding body in front of them. There's maybe a cartoon that is a drawing of a bleeding body. So there's a little bit difference there. However, I think the results are still worthy of looking at and figuring out at least like helping us better understand how dark humor works, and then we can figure out how that applies to our responders. So I just wanted to point that out, that these are sort of theoretical situations in the form of cartoons that were presented to these participants in these studies. So here are some of the correlations they found in the research when trying to find who can appreciate or more easily use dark humor. So they found, it says here, the most surprising result was that subjects who showed the highest values of dark humor preference and comprehension also showed the highest values of intelligence and education, with the lowest values for mood disturbance and aggression. And again, that kind of goes back to what I was saying just a second ago about it not being super intuitive. In fact, it's counterintuitive, that someone who is emotionally stable and educated would be more likely to enjoy or be able to appreciate dark humor than someone who is unhappy, depressed, angry, and uneducated, or has a lower IQ. So, like I said, it totally is the opposite of what you would think. So on the other hand, subjects who showed average verbal and nonverbal intelligence scores and higher mood disturbances with aggressiveness towards others actually had the lowest values for appreciation and preference of dark humor. It doesn't make sense, like I said, but that's what the research showed. So what does it mean? It says, at the very least, the research is obviously counterintuitive. It also demonstrates the complexity of how and why we use humor. It shows that someone who's in a bad mood is not really going to appreciate dark humor as much as you would think they would. They don't. Another hypothesis would be that aggressiveness as well as bad mood could lead to a reduced information processing capacity with respect to cognitively demanding tasks such as processing humor. So I suppose someone who's in a bad mood, maybe, or anxious even, like if you think about that, the less your cortex is working, the thinking part of the brain, the less you're able to engage according to this. You need an intelligence, you need an IQ, you need verbal, nonverbal intelligences in order to appreciate dark humor. So if you think about it, if you're in a threat response, if you're depressed, if you're angry, whatever is going on with you, your cortex is shutting down. So your thinking part of your brain is not as active, and therefore you're not going to appreciate dark humor. According to Mindis and colleagues, 1985, a preference for dark humor is related to the ability to treat nasty contents as playful fiction. It says humor arises from potentially negative situations. It says behavioral scientist Peter McGraw, University of Colorado. That's counterintuitive for obvious reasons. Why does something so good originate from something potentially bad or wrong? He asks. McGraw and his colleagues attempt to answer the question in 2 recent papers published in Psychological Science. They propose an explanation for the humor in a theory they call the benign-violation theory, which is what I was talking about earlier. This is grounded in the idea that people are amused by moral violations, threats to their normal worldviews, for instance, or disparaging statements, but only so long as these violations are harmless. So that's that sweet spot. Like I was saying, it can't be all good, it can't be all bad. It has to be incongruent. There has to be a little bit of both for it to be humorous. So when the threat of the... and I think this I believe could apply to our first responders. It says when the tone of the threat is playful or the setting safe, a violation that might otherwise elicit sadness or fear instead elicits laughter. So what transforms these threatening violations into harmless jokes? According to this theory, it's something called psychological distance. So if something hurts, you want to get away from it. So what they're saying here is when you have a negative situation, there are lots of different ways we can separate ourselves or get a distance from it. You can talk about something from the past. You can talk about somebody, maybe as opposed to a loved one, somebody you don't know. You could talk about somebody who's physically far away from you. Let's see what else. So they have spatial distance, social distance, temporal distance, which is the time thing, and then just basically mental distance, meaning that hypothetical events are not as threatening as real life ones, like the cartoons versus the responders going on a bad call in real life, in real time. So in the benign violation theory, a joke fails or succeeds depending on its unique blend of moral threat, emotional safety, and that psychological distance. So, knowing now how dark humor works, that you have something bad and you need to get a distance from it in order for it not to be so harmful, that the dark humor is the result. Now, if you think of yourself as a first responder, and let's say you had a terrible accident on the freeway and you have to go and you're the first person there and there are body parts all over the asphalt, there's blood, there could be family members in the ditch crying, and maybe there's other people still trapped in the car, and you still have traffic coming, you got all kinds of things going on. That's a very negative experience. And if you're not careful, your amygdala could be triggered. The threat detector, that's what the amygdala is, could be triggered, which would slow down the thinking of the cortex, which would then not allow you to encode the memories of the events with the timestamp, which is the language component, which happens in the cortex. So if the cortex is shutting down, there's no language, there's no narrative timestamp with that memory. When that memory is encoded without that timestamp, your brain doesn't know when it happened. You can have PTSD because your brain thinks it's still happening. Whereas if you can keep your cortex operating, you get not only the encoding of your sensory information, the smell, taste, hear, all that. You also get the narrative component that says, this is what happened, this is when it happened. I did what I was trained to do. I did everything I could. There's no reason for me to feel guilty that maybe somebody didn't make it. And also, after this moment is done, your brain will know this is in the rearview mirror. It's not going to be in the windshield, perpetually haunting you in the form of PTSD. So if you can get that social distance by way of dark humor, that means you've just averted the threat response. That means your cortex can keep working. That means you can make good decisions as a first responder. You can coordinate traffic. You can, call for the ambulance, backup, whatever you need to do, save a life, help the family that's on the side, maybe get somebody to take care of the kids that are over there, whatever you need to do. It just makes sense that you would need to keep your cortex working. And if dark humor lets you do that, it not only lets you do that, it gives you that psychological distance so that you feel like this isn't as close to me. This isn't as, threatening in this moment. It gives you that little bit of psychological distance, even if you can't give yourself the physical distance. Because let's say you have to give CPR to someone who's dying and there's blood all over the place, and you have to not only smell the blood, you have to taste the blood, you have to feel the blood. It's getting all over your uniform. That's a lot of sensory information and not good information to be encoding. But if you can give yourself that little bit of psychological distance, that could actually help you cope, stay in your body, avoid that threat response, and therefore avoid PTSD. I learn a lot from my clients about the conditions I treat by hearing their stories and their experiences through the years, how they got through things, how maybe they didn't get through things, and how and why that happened. So one of my clients, who's a retired trooper, and his wife, who is a retired EMS, were kind enough to share with me their thoughts on the use of dark humor. And they came to the conclusion the most important factor to consider is the audience. So they were kind enough to send me an email describing a scenario of when it's good and when it's bad and why, with a similar situation. So, for example, in example A, we have a firefighter and a police officer who respond to a head-on collision on the freeway. There's a female in a small Volkswagen car, a Beetle, and the gentleman is in a big semi-truck. They had the collision. The lady's body is torn to pieces all over the freeway, but the gentleman survived. He's fine. So the firefighter turns to the officer and says, She must have been really pissed off at that guy because she fell to pieces when he hit her. So the officer could chuckle at that, and they could go on with their job, right? They can just go on and do what they need to do on that job or on that call, and maybe that helped to alleviate some anxiety and tension and help them to do what they need to do and focus on their work. The only problem is there's an extra audience member there that they didn't realize. And that was the truck driver. That truck driver heard that comment and later committed suicide. He could not get the image of the girl's body out of his mind, and he could not get the comment of the firefighter out of his mind. And within a week, he killed himself. So I think had that gentleman not heard the comment, it would have worked fine. But because he heard it, that's a good example of how it can help one person avoid PTSD, but can actually contribute to the PTSD of someone else if you're not careful. In scenario B, it's the same officer and firefighter. There's an accident, a similar situation. Someone's in a small car, but this time, not only is the leg here, the arm there, and torso over there, the head is detached. And maybe remembering the last situation, in this case, it's the officer who makes the joke to the firefighter. And the officer says, "She really lost her head on this one." Assuming the firefighter would laugh, because the firefighter is the one who made the joke the first time around. But in this case, the firefighter, turns out his son had just died a week earlier while skiing from a traumatic head injury. So this comment about the head triggered the son's death that is very fresh in this firefighter's mind. And unfortunately, the officer didn't know that. And the firefighter didn't tell him that. So the firefighter just walked away and started crying. And the officer didn't know why. So you could even so the moral of the story in that one is that you could be using dark humor with one of your coworkers on a regular basis and think that, oh, this guy jokes with me all the time with dark humor, and so I'm going to joke back with him about it. But you might not realize that on that particular call, there's something that's going to trigger something that happened in the personal life of that responder, and that's going to hurt them even more than what's going on in the call. So again, it has to do with the audience. So they said, one of the comments from my client and his wife was that if you're in doubt of whether or not to use dark humor on a call, just don't use it. If there's any chance that somebody is not going to benefit from this, that they're actually going to be hurt from it, just don't use it. It's not worth it. Because as they say, if you don't use it, the one who suffers will be you. But if you do use it, potentially you will not be the only one who will suffer, but now you're going to cause suffering in other people. So I think that's something to be aware of. And in other words, again, it kind of goes back to not only finding that sweet spot, of not too bad, not too good to make it funny, but you have to know who your audience is in order to know what is too good or what is too bad for that person in that particular context of that particular situation. So in other words, had that officer made a joke about the person's leg, maybe it wouldn't have affected the firefighter that much. But it just so happened he made the joke about the head, not knowing that the firefighter had just had a son die with a head injury. So that's where it can get tricky. So I also kind of want to talk about the benefits of laughter, because obviously if you're using humor, the result of that is laughing, right? And everybody knows, like, laughter makes you feel good. But there are also other benefits to laughing. I mean, laughing can help us in a lot of different ways. It can help us socially, it can help us physically, and it can help us mentally. socially, it helps us bond with the people around us because we're all affecting each other. We're doing something, saying something funny that causes the other person to laugh, and then we're laughing together. So it's sort of a way of exchanging, energy and I don't know, attuning, I guess. I don't know how else to describe it, but by laughing, it's almost like a dance. You're doing something, the other person's responding, they're laughing, you're laughing, and while you're laughing, obviously you're happy because laughter is a positive motion or positive thing to do, and so you're enjoying that positive experience together. So it can help us socially, it can help us physiologically by loosening up our muscles, forcing us to take more breaths, deeper breaths, which it would help us to increase our heart rate. It can help us take in more oxygen. It can increase pleasurable neurotransmitters. So, and then mentally, like I was saying earlier, it could theoretically prevent PTSD by helping us relax the body, which reduces the threat response activity in the amygdala, thereby increasing cortex activity, conscious thinking, working memory, so we can encode all of our memories with the narrative timestamp. And then also kind of in a way what it does is it normalizes negative experiences. So one of my clients was explaining to me that on his first call on a suicide, he arrived to the call with his field training officer, his FTO, and he was about to throw up, I guess, because this person shot himself. But his FTO made a joke and said something to the effect of, there's nothing like a good head trauma to make me hungry for bacon and eggs. And my client said that even though he was just ready to throw up, it was the tone, it was the confidence and the calmness that his FTO used, and just the smile that made him feel better. And he said he was surprised he didn't want to throw up after that. In fact, they did go out and have breakfast. So it's kind of funny. In that case, the dark humor worked and helped him realize, we don't have to take this so seriously. We don't have to be ready to go into threat response just because this is a tragic situation. And it's horrible to look at, it's horrible to smell, it's horrible to get it all over our uniform, the blood and the body parts and all that stuff. But if you can get that psychological distance, it's almost like getting a physiological distance because you're psychologically removing yourself from it, from the bad part, the negativity of it. Even Freud was talking about the use of dark humor. Back in, 1905, Freud hypothesized that humor allows for a temporary and relatively safe release of usually repressed sexual and aggressive urges in the form of wits, he said. I thought it might be fun to tell a couple jokes that are a little bit, I don't know, maybe they're dark, but there's one here I like from Dimitri Martin. That's the comedian that draws on the sketch pads, the flip chart thing. Anyway, he says, the words "I'm sorry" and "I apologize" mean the same thing, except when you're at a funeral. That's funny. Another comedian, Stephen Wright, he says, if at first you don't succeed, then skydiving isn't for you. Another one you can find all over the internet is by Robert Bloch, who says, despite my ghoulish reputation, I actually have the heart of a small boy. I keep it in a jar on my desk. Another one about World War II is, by Al McGuire. He says, the only mystery in life is why did the kamikaze pilots wear helmets? So, if you can joke about World War II, right? So I guess there are pros and cons, like I said. I guess also, as I am exploring this topic, which is super fascinating to me, I also wonder about the impact of dark humor on the first responder culture in general. For example, within the station, if people are using dark humor to cope, could it lead to a disrespectful culture within the agency where people are taking cell phone pictures of body parts and bringing it back and talking about it, joking about it, upsetting other people within the station, but maybe they don't want to say anything? Could that then contribute to a hostile workplace? What if, as in the example with the firefighter whose son had just died of a head trauma, what if someone's making a joke about a call that they just went on, but someone within the station just had a loved one die of a similar illness or injury? So again, I think you have to find that sweet spot of, not too good, not too bad, but also where's the audience at? Who is going to hear me say what I'm saying? Are we going to be joking about the mangled body parts in the car accident when the loved ones who survived the wreck are on the shoulder of the freeway and they might hear us talking? Or the driver of the survivor in the other vehicle, like that semi-truck driver who heard that comment about the girl going to pieces? We have to be really careful when we're using dark humor who's around us. And even if you've used dark humor with the same person on many calls in the past, you have to also be careful if that person just had something happen in their personal life where that might trigger a negative reaction. So I think it's a really interesting concept. I really believe it is something that I am definitely going to continue to research because, let's be honest. Using a dark humor doesn't cost any money. You can use it anytime you want, day or night. So if it's an effective tool, it's amazing because it doesn't cost any money. So it could save somebody from PTSD and cost $0. That's amazing. So it's efficient, it's convenient. Again, it can also be kind of destructive if your audience is sensitive to it. So that's where I'm at with this. And, the reason I'm doing these podcasts is I want to share with everybody what this journey is like for me as an outsider coming into this culture. Kind of like I talked about before, the Matrix, taking the red pill and climbing out of my cocoon. I for sure feel like that. And just like my work with the veterans or the people with gender dysphoria, I went through the same process with them, but I didn't really document it. I kind of have ideas of certain things that I remember, having revelations about, but I'm really glad that now I'm documenting this process because I didn't get to hear about treating responders in grad school. As I've said a million times, I wish I had. I would have just gone after it with, I would have eaten that up. So there aren't a lot of therapists treating first responders. Those who attempt to treat first responders do not do a good job. They just pretty much chase them out of their office, just like they do with veterans. Because if you don't know veteran culture, they're not going to come back after their intake, because you probably would have driven them nuts if you're just a regular therapist. So you have to know your population. So as I am learning this population, as I'm sort of infiltrating into their culture, I am going to use these podcasts to share with you my journey, so that hopefully if you're a therapist out there or a psych major, you may be inspired by what I'm experiencing. Or if you're just a clinician who maybe is not credentialed as a first responder counselor, but maybe you have a client with a loved one who's a responder, or maybe you ended up with a first responder client. Hopefully what I'm experiencing will help you to develop some more insight into what that responder is dealing with, and as a clinician, what it's like to be on the other side of that responder in the room and hear what they're saying and what they're going through, and how should we as clinicians be processing that. So as I said in the beginning, most people would probably think as a clinician that I would be saying dark humor is really bad and we shouldn't be using it, because it dehumanizes people and it objectifies and could be insulting and disrespectful and demoralizing and yeah. But we can't overlook the benefits of it. And that's not something that would be necessarily common sense going into it as a clinician. So this is just one of the few topics that, like I said, I'm kind of excited about because I love humor, and I want to find out, what is the formula for this? And I've even joked, like, maybe we could create retreats or like a treatment regimen with stand-up comedy where we provide responders with dark humor to help them normalize what they deal with and help them to get that emotional distance or that psychological distance from the kinds of things that they're dealing with day to day. I think it would be, who knows? I mean, sky's the limit. We could do all kinds of fun things for responders. I also believe we need to be careful with offending whoever is in the audience, other people within the station. Like, what if the dispatch girl hears the dark humor and she gets upset about it, but she doesn't want to say anything because she's trying to bond with the team? So, you have to be really careful about the people around you when you're using dark humor. For that reason, I believe the supervisors within each agency and or the HR should be doing trainings on coping with hard calls, just basically the things I'm talking about in my podcast. They should be doing ongoing trainings and continuing to hold accountable the responder culture within their agency to make sure they're not violating state labor laws, that they're not creating a hostile work environment, that they are helping their team to use dark humor strategically without getting into trouble, hurting their teammates, inadvertently, that kind of thing. So it can be used, but I feel like there's a huge need for the training and the supervision of the supervisors in HR departments. And I think it would be worth creating some post trainings on this topic. And I would love to do it because I would probably fill it with a bunch of jokes, and I think it'd be a blast just to put that together. So in fact, as I'm researching this topic, that's kind of what I have in the back of my mind, is how I would put together some post trainings on this. Because if I can help responders to get that psychological distance from the negative situation they're in, all the negative sensory and emotional experience going on, that's huge. That's very important, and that is very valuable for our responders to have. So that could keep them from going home and drinking after every shift. That could keep them from getting PTSD. That's incredible. So I'm going to keep researching the topic, and like I said, hopefully put together a post-training outline for it. If you have an agency in California or Oregon and you'd like to work with me to put together training, just get a hold of me. I would love to do it. So thanks for watching. And as usual, I'll leave the comment section open. I'd love to hear what you have to say about dark humor. If you're a responder or you're a clinician or you're a loved one of a responder, if you have any experience with this, good or bad, if you have some ideas, I would love to hear it. So thank you so much. And don't forget to subscribe and like so we can get more exposure and help more responders. All right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.